Welcome to the Islet Hub podcast, where we will delve into the world of evidence-based knowledge on English language education in Quebec. Wonderful. So today I have the pleasure of welcoming Diane Gérin-Lajoie. She is recognized for her scholarship on official language minorities in Canada and their schools. Her expertise in the areas of identity and youth in minority language schools, as well as teacher identity in those schools, make her a pioneer in the comparative analysis of Canada's two official linguistic minority groups. Recipient of multiple research funds, author of several books, book chapters, and academic articles, Diane Gérin-Lajoie makes a significant contribution to the study of the two official language minorities in Canada. She is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Thank you, Diane, for taking the time to come and talk to us about your specialty.
Oh, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here.
I think what I want to start off with is of course, welcoming you here, but also ask you how you were drawn to this field of study. What was your trajectory that led you to this field of study?
Okay. And when I obtained my position as a faculty member, I was also cross-appointed to a research center at OISI that is called le Centre de Recherche en Éducation Franco-Ontarienne. And in that research center, the focus of research at the time was really on Francophone identity, and most particularly in the schools. So I was drawn to change a little bit my trajectory in research. I'm a sociologist of education by training. So I began to be interested to what was going on in the French minority language schools. Mm-hmm. And myself as a Francophone in Toronto. But so the complexity of languages came to my mind at the personal level and professional level. So I began to do research in schools. During one of those researches, I would address the question of identity with the teenagers. A lot of them would talk to me about a bilingual identity. And at the time, the only research that was done on bilingual identity in Ontario for the Francophones, they were really more quantitative studies and very reductionist. I obtained a first SURE grant, and I did a study on the Francophones in Ontario. And so that's how it got started.
Mm-hmm. Of course, you had expertise, but at the same time, it was propelled by a situation that you were living in a personal context. So that drove you to want to ask more questions and to delve into this research further.
My daughter was about the age of the teenagers that I was working with. So it was really interesting as a parent, as a Francophone living in a minority setting, as an academic, and as a professor too, because I had to teach about these things.
And so what's really interesting to me is your study regarding youth in English high schools in Montreal. I know you've conducted that one, and also you've drawn a comparative with youth in the regions in Quebec. So I wonder if you could talk about that.
First of all, I use qualitative research. I'm not really into statistics in terms of working with the statistics. I mean is that when you look at quantitative analysis, it's mostly based on statistics, on numbers. It lacks the possibility of looking more deeply at a situation. So when you use qualitative research, it's about what people share with you. It's about a smaller sample of participants, and it gives you the opportunity to really develop a relationship with the participants, which is quite important when you do research, to get really the voice of the people with who you are working. So when I decided to work on the English speaking situation in Quebec in the schools, I had already done two projects in Ontario, one on the kids, one on teachers working in the minority schools. So I decided, why not look at the other official minority in Quebec? Process of recruitment in research it's sometimes a difficult process. So, but finally I was able to work in high school, one in Montreal and one on the south shore of Montreal, because I wanted to see, even in the area of Montreal, if there were some sort of differences, interesting differences that I could use for my analysis.
So I wonder what methodology you used once you identified your participants, and then what were your findings that were quite striking for you?
Yeah. In my research, at the beginning of my studies, I have used a very short survey, a quantitative tool, but only for the purpose of getting a smaller sample for my ethnographic study. Because the study in Montreal, I use ethnography, which means that I did observation in the schools. I did interviews with the kids, with some teachers, with the parents, friends. As I said, in the Montreal area, I was in the classrooms. I selected in each of the two schools 5 students for a total of 10 students. Like I had one research assistant and myself. You cannot have a lot of participants. To do observation in the context of an ethnography, you're supposed to spend a lot of time doing the observation. I did 6 individual interviews with them over the period of the 3 years of the project. Their teachers were also interviewed individually. I met with the family members, siblings and parents, in a group interview, and I did also a group interview with their friends. So what I tried to do in that study is to understand the context not only of the school, but also everything that was gravitating around the school.
What did you begin asking them so that you could delve into, to have access to their feelings of or sense of identities?
I had a question that I wanted to know or to learn how they would see themselves in terms of their identity. So the answers were, they had to choose between francophone, bilingual identity, plurilingual identity, trilingual identity, and Anglophone. And based on that, I developed a sample. So when I began to work with them, doing interviews and stuff like that, I had divided each of the interviews. First one was about the school. The second one was about identity. The third one was about their friends. What I found out is that what they had put on their survey in terms of their rapport to identity was not necessarily how they would talk about it in interviews. And the way that they talk about their rapport to identity and languages at the beginning, they have really reflected on that notion. At the very end of each of my study, what I do is I ask the participants, what did they think about participating? And quite often, one of the answer was, well, it made me think about my own identity and my place in society. And so it was quite interesting.
What you discovered in terms of, you talk about linguistic identity and that the students, you wanted to see if they would identify with either language, French or English, being a francophone or an anglophone, or a bilingual identity.
I think that when you look at the concept of identity, language and culture are something that come up easily. And the sense of belonging also depend on the social context in which you live. And it has to do very much with the sense of belonging of the individuals. And for example, if I compare, I will go back to my Francophone, French-speaking kids in Ontario. When the kids go to a French minority language schools where everything is in French, it's not immersion.
Mm-hmm.
It's not immersion. They have that, the relationship that, or the rapport that the school try to establish with the student is that it is more than a language. There is that culture, but there is also activities with the friends. And in Ontario, we have a lot of French immersion schools. And in those schools, the mandate is not to do the promotion of the French as it is in the French minority language schools. This is different in Quebec because it's easy to see that the language power is very different in Quebec because we know that, yes, English is considered as an official minority in Canada, and they are a minority in Quebec. So the majority is French-speaking. But when you look, Quebec is still in Canada, where English is the majority language. So my experience doing research in English-speaking schools, it's very different from the ones in Ontario, because language is not seen as being threatening. If I can pursue about that idea that language is not just a tool of communication, it really depends of the family context in which you live too. It was very much related to how the language practices were done in the family circle. So I had two students, for example, that were friends. And in one of the family, English was dominant, and for the other student, it was French that was dominant. When you look at language, and it's really difficult to pinpoint exactly how it comes about, but when I talk about identity, even when I talk about linguistic identity, you cannot cut that off a more personal identity, how you identify as a person. I mean, there are different identities. It was difficult for me to get the participants to try to define or to explain the relationship between culture and language. It's a very complex area.
It's multifaceted, I think. Would you agree that almost like a phenomena that manifests itself in the specific context, like in the context of Montreal and Quebec in particular, and will identify or relate in various ways in this context? So would you say it's quite unique?
I think that the situation in Quebec in terms of that duality between English and French, very different from, outside of Quebec. I think it's unique in the sense that it's like that definition of majority, minority does not, even if it's based on numbers, there is more to it. The way the census data are interpreted, especially at the government level, really make it almost as the creation or the definition of only two categories. I think this is why, qualitative research is important. Because this is not either one or the other. It's really a mix of different things, and you can see it even, and my research is at the school level, so I cannot talk in terms of economic or even political. The last research I did in Quebec was replicating, again, the study in Montreal, and I did it in two regions in the province. The space plays a role also in the way that people will develop their social practices. Place and space, if I can say, because the place is more about one, like a high school, for example, in a small area of Quebec. And it's clear that the way that the kids in those regions identify is different from the ones in Montreal. And their entire way of looking at the role of English and the role of the school. I think the major difference has to do with the place and the space, Like in the Montreal area, they live, especially in Montreal, you can live as an English-speaking individual. French is the public language. And by the way, the kids in my research have all acknowledged the importance of French. And in fact, they all told me that in the public space, they use French because they're bilingual. When you get to the kids in region, in those two schools, most of them are coming from French-speaking families, but that have still the right to have their children being educated in English. There you will hear French a lot in the school. And you might hear teachers saying, well, speak English. And le rapport to the language is different. Like some parents and some kids have told me in region, for example, that being educated in English was a privilege. In Montreal, they claim it as a right. Identity is so complex that it's something that you have not to look at that notion from a very prescriptive background, if I can say. And you cannot look at identity, at least within that generation and now the other generations, of people, as something that the kids will necessarily choose or will deny one to the profit of the other. Some of the kids that have said that they had a bilingual identity because, in the public sphere, when you look at that, Montreal, like municipal activities, are mostly done in French. They cross the linguistic boundaries very easily, and nobody seemed to mind about that. I have tried to demonstrate this identity is not something that can be looked at only from a very limited focus.
And many allophones work in English all the time. Many allophones will solely work in French all the time. So how do you make sense of these terms coming into play and in establishing a sense of identity?
From my experience with the group in Montreal, the one that were talking in terms of trilingual identity, most of them were from an Italian background. And depending with who you were talking, like for example, one young woman was explaining to me that even though her Italian was not good, now that she spoke barely Italian, she was Italian. And it happens in other circumstances that even though someone does not necessarily use the language on a regular basis, they feel a real sense of belonging to that language. But I think that that's where also it comes into play, that relationship with traditions, in terms of the language used in the private sphere, in the family. And I don't want to be too critical here, but I think that the focus should be much more on the public use of language. I think that's normal that people will use the language to which they relate the most. I think that is part of that dichotomy that people look at language as if you can decide what is needed in each sphere of life.
You talk about identity as really being a social construct, whereas you expand on that. And I wonder if you can give us more detail.
Identity is understood. It's still considered as something that you get at your birth, and it's automatically transmitted. In the family, you speak that language, you have that culture, and it's transmitted through generation. When you look at identity as a social construct, you define it as something that is always in mouvance, that I call, meaning that your rapport to identity might change over time, depending on the context in which you live and depending of your experiences in life. And I think it's especially true to use that approach when you look at minorities, linguistic minorities, but also, ethnic minorities, immigrants, like that way of looking at identity gives you the opportunity to see the complexity of that concept. For example, I was born in a small town in Quebec. I never questioned my identity until I moved to Toronto, and more specifically until I had my daughter. When I got to Toronto, I became a minority, a member of a linguistic minority. It was an adaptation to make, and that, as I said, brought me to think more in terms of who I was, and I stayed very, very francophone, even if I have lived in Toronto for decades. Mm-hmm. And I have, as you can hear, I have a very strong accent, but I don't mind because my roots are really, as a Quebecoise, it's also the way that others perceive you, and so that add even more complexity.
And bringing it back to the schools, the youth in the schools have lived these situations in a school context that allows them to constantly confront themselves with what they thought their identity might be.
It's not a crisis for them. That's the way they live. Like they don't see speaking French as a problem.
Does your study then dismantle the common portrait that is made of youths enrolled in English-speaking schools?
Very few of them define themselves as only Anglophones or only Francophones. It's really in the middle categories. Same thing in the region. I was really surprised about that because very small number of the students in the region, the fact that they were in an English-speaking school made them think that they had a bilingual identity because during the day they were living in one language and outside of the school in the other. But if you would meet them on the street, you would not say that. Mm-hmm. They have a bilingual identity and Anglophone identity. I don't think that it's for the teenagers, for example. This is not something that they will really stop and think about because that's the way, like a lot of the kids in the schools that I have done research in Ontario and here, they use the language of the person who is talking to them. Mm-hmm. I think that we are quite far from the time that notion of national identity was understood the same way. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because it's not understood the same way anymore.
I wonder now, you also conducted another study, Anglophones Teaching and Living in Quebec, and I wonder if you could speak a bit about that.
Just before talking about that role in Quebec, and I mentioned it very briefly, like I think the way that the two linguistic minorities look at the role of the school is different. It's outside of Quebec. It's a matter of almost survival from their point of view, because they are taking a very monolithic view of language too. In Quebec, as I said before, English is not an issue, like to lose it, but the communities are really concerned with keeping the youth in Quebec. So one of the objectives of the English-speaking schools, from what I heard from people working in these schools and in some studies, is that it is absolutely essential to provide the kids with very excellent skills in French in order for them to stay in the province and to become civil participants. That's interesting because the study that I did, teachers, I really used the approach of the life history, the life story, in terms of my methodology. So I spent a lot of time doing interviews with them, but also I met with their family and their friends. And that question about how do you see your role? Some of them told me, well, I've never thought of that I could have another role than transmitting knowledge. So it was kind of interesting also in terms of finding to see that in the case of the English schools in Quebec, because it's not part of the mandate to safeguard the language, I think it was almost natural that they saw their role, I think, in terms of agent of linguistic reproduction. I wanted to see how what I call the personal identity of the teacher, when you couple that with their professional identity, what is the impact at the classroom level? Are they going to be more aware of the importance of talking about minority and identity or not? From what they told me, it never crossed their mind that they had a special role to play. And what was really interesting also is that in the schools, there were at the time, quite a number of French-speaking teachers that were not teachers of French, but they were teaching in English, but from a French background. At the time that I did the study in Ontario, that I didn't find that. In Ontario, they would, identify as francophone, mostly. And in Quebec, depending on if they were French-speaking, they would say French. But that was an interesting finding for me, because I would have thought that most of the teaching staff would be, English speaking, but doesn't seem to be the case because I was interviewing teachers. In Montreal, that's not all of the teachers that said, I'm English speaking Canadian, or I am a Canadian. They would identify more as an English-speaking Quebecer, but also as a Montrealer, depending of and again, it's the relationship to the space. They would not necessarily define themselves as English Canadians. The few of them in the region that were English-speaking, they were talking more in terms of, presenting themselves as being Canadian, but they also, all of them related that question in relationship to when they travel. They will say that they are from Quebec or from Canada or from Montreal. The Anglophone teachers did not necessarily relate to the rest of the Anglophones in Canada, which is kind of interesting because a few of them explained to me that, for example, when they go to Toronto or some other places, English-speaking people do not consider them as their equal in terms of identification because they're from Quebec. Because you see, like even in the language, the words that English-speaking people use in Montreal is very colored by French words. They're not really like them because they live in Quebec. So that's another interesting point.
I'm wondering what you see as a future research and where it should be directed.
In terms of le rapport to identity and language and all of that and place in society, I think that there is not, and I'm talking about Quebec, there is not enough studies taking qualitative research perspective. And what is interesting also is that when research began to be done within a more qualitatively oriented look, they were done by researchers outside of Quebec. I think that to have those, if I can say, snapshots of what is going on in different regions, different schools, what you're saying, the allophone question within the English-speaking schools, it's almost a tricky one because since 1977, immigrants cannot have their children in English-speaking schools. So this is an area that would benefit with more research to understand, there are some specific rules, like you can be in English-speaking schools for a year or like a short term. And all of that, I think, would necessitate more information, more studies on that. And specifically when you are what we call an allophone, what does it mean in an English-speaking school? We had that a little bit. I had that a little bit in my study with the teachers because of different backgrounds, but specifically on that issue, there should be more done.
Wonderful. To be continued then on the discourse of identity. Well, this has been incredibly eye-opening, interesting. I thank you so much,
You're
Diane.
welcome. That was, as I said before, it was very nice of you to invite me to discuss these issues.
It's our pleasure, of course, and I think these are issues that need continuous discussion and reflection. So thank you for all the work that you do.
You're welcome.
This podcast is part of the Islet Impact project funded by the Department of Canadian Heritage. Islet Impact is an educational initiative of the Quebec English-speaking communities research network known as Questcrin, which also receives funding from the Secrétariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise, the Canadian Institute for Research on Linguistic Minorities, and Concordia University.